The wolf was mid-air when Margaret saw it, pale as moonlight, massive as a horse, teeth bared in what should have been her final moment. She had one hand on the cabin door, the other clutching her late husband's Winchester, and in that frozen instant, she could see straight through the creature's ribs to the pine trees beyond. The beast's eyes burned silver white, and its breath, if you could call it breath, came out in clouds of frost that hung in the July heat. Margaret didn't scream. After 73 years of prairie winters, cattle rustlers, and burying 2 sons, she'd forgotten how. The wolf's massive paws were inches from her chest when it twisted in midair, landing beside her instead of on her, and did something she would never, in all her years, have expected. It sat down, right there on her porch. The ghost wolf's head tilted to one side, and from its mouth came a sound that made her knees weak. A whimper, soft and pleading, like a puppy begging to come in from a storm. What I'm about to tell you today will surprise you. But first tell me, where are you listening from? I love knowing which corner of the country you're joining me from. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Margaret's hands hadn't stopped shaking since she lowered the rifle. The ghost wolf sat there on the weathered porch boards, its translucent form flickering like candlelight in wind. She could count every plank through its belly. The creature's ears were flat against its massive head, and those silver eyes, Lord, those eyes, held something she recognized. Not hunger, not rage, something closer to desperation, the kind she'd seen in her husband's face the night before he died, when he knew the fever had him and there wasn't a thing anyone could do. She took one step back. The wolf whimpered again, softer this time. Its front paw lifted slightly as if asking permission, then lowered. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs hard enough to hurt. She'd heard the stories, same as everyone in 3 counties. Livestock found torn open. Tracks in the snow that disappeared into nothing. Old Ezra Patterson swore he'd seen something pale and huge cross his property last winter, moving through a blizzard like it was made of the storm itself. Nobody believed him until his best mare turned up dead, throat ripped clean through, no blood in the snow. "What do you want?" Margaret heard herself say. Her voice came out thin and cracked. The wolf's head tilted the other way. Its mouth opened, and for one terrible moment she thought it might speak. Instead, it rose slowly to its feet, all 4 paws making no sound whatsoever on the wood, and turned its massive head toward the barn. The structure sat 50 yards from the house, its red paint faded to rust, door hanging crooked on leather hinges. The wolf looked back at her, then toward the barn again. The message was clear as church bells. Margaret didn't move. Couldn't, really. Her legs had turned to water. The creature took 2 steps toward the barn, stopped, looked back once more, those silver eyes fixed on hers. Then it did something that made her stomach drop. It walked straight through the porch railing. Didn't jump over, didn't go around, just passed through the wood like it was morning mist. On the other side, it stopped and waited. Its form grew fainter in the sunlight, almost invisible, but she could still see the shape of it, still see those eyes watching her. She looked down at the Winchester in her hands. Her husband Thomas had taught her to shoot when she was barely 16, fresh off the wagon from Missouri. "Don't aim where it is," he'd said. "Aim where it's going to be." But how do you aim at something that isn't quite there? How do you shoot a ghost? Margaret's fingers tightened on the rifle anyway. It was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly stopped making sense. The wolf moved another few steps toward the barn, its paws leaving no prints in the dust. Against every shred of common sense she'd accumulated in 7 decades, Margaret stepped off the porch. The July sun beat down on her shoulders, hot enough to sting through her thin cotton dress. Grasshoppers scattered from the dried grass at her feet. In the distance, she could hear the creek running low, just a trickle between stones. Everything was normal. Everything was real. Except for the transparent wolf the size of a small horse leading her toward the barn like some kind of frontier spirit guide. Her mouth was dry as alkali dust. The walk to the barn felt like it took an hour, though it couldn't have been more than a minute. With each step, Margaret's mind raced through possibilities. Maybe she'd had a stroke. Her sister Ruth had gone that way, talking to people who weren't there, seeing things in the wallpaper. Or maybe the heat had finally gotten to her. It had been over 100 degrees for 12 straight days. She'd heard of men going mad from heat, walking into the desert without their hats, babbling about angels. But the wolf looked back at her again, and there was nothing mad or fevered about what she saw. Just that pleading, that need. The barn door hung open about a foot, same as it had been for the past 2 months since the leather hinge finally gave out. Margaret hadn't bothered fixing it. What was the point? No animals left to keep in or out. Her last cow had died in March, and she'd sold the chickens to the Hendersons when she couldn't afford feed anymore. The barn was just an empty shell now, full of dust and memories and tools too rusted to use. The wolf reached the door and stopped. It turned to face her fully, and she saw that its form was growing more solid somehow, darker, as if being close to the barn gave it strength. Margaret stopped 10 feet away. The rifle felt heavy. Her arms ached from holding it. "I don't understand," she said to the creature, to herself, to the empty prairie stretching out in all directions. "What's in there that matters to you?" The wolf's ears pricked forward. Then it did something that made her breath catch. It pressed its nose against the barn door and pushed. The door swung inward with a long creak of protesting wood. Darkness yawned beyond. The wolf looked at her one more time, then walked into that darkness and disappeared. For a long moment, Margaret stood in the blazing sun and considered walking back to the house, barring the door, loading every gun Thomas had left her. Maybe riding into town for Doc Morrison or Sheriff Coleman, though what she'd tell them she had no idea. "There's a ghost wolf in my barn" would get her committed to the asylum in Cheyenne faster than you could spit. But her feet moved forward anyway, carrying her toward that dark doorway. She'd spent her whole life doing things that scared her. This was just one more. The inside of the barn smelled like old hay and bird droppings and creosote from the posts Thomas had sealed 30 years back. Dust motes swirled in the shaft of sunlight coming through the door. Margaret's eyes took a moment to adjust. When they did, she saw the wolf standing in the center of the barn, near the old stalls. It was looking down at something on the ground. Its form was brighter here, more visible in the shadows. She could see the shape of its fur now, each hair distinct and frost-white. Could see the muscles moving under its hide as it breathed, though she still couldn't understand how something not quite real could breathe. She moved closer, rifle ready, but pointed at the ground. Her boots kicked up small clouds of dust. The wolf didn't move, just kept staring down. Margaret came around its massive shoulder. Even in death or whatever this was, it stood taller than her waist, and looked where it was looking. There, half buried in old straw and dirt, was a leather saddlebag. She recognized it immediately. Her breath left her in a rush. The bag was Thomas's, the one he'd been carrying the day he left for Denver to sell their cattle, 5 years ago this August, the day he never came home. The wolf made a sound deep in its chest. Not quite a growl, not quite a whine. Margaret dropped to her knees, set the rifle aside, and reached for the saddlebag with trembling hands. The leather was stiff and cold, filmed with dust and cobwebs. She'd searched this barn 100 times after Thomas disappeared. 100 times. The sheriff had searched it. The ranch hands had searched it. How had none of them seen this? She pulled the bag toward her, and it was heavy, heavier than it should be. Her fingers worked at the buckle, numb and clumsy. Inside were papers, letters, by the feel of them. But beneath the papers was something else, something wrapped in oilcloth. Margaret pulled it out, set it in her lap, and slowly unwrapped it. The cloth fell away and she was looking at a stack of money. More money than she'd seen in her entire life. $100 bills bound with string, packed tight. Enough to save the ranch 10 times over. Enough to explain why Thomas had disappeared without a trace. Enough to kill for. Her vision blurred. The barn seemed to tilt sideways. She looked up at the wolf. It was watching her with those silver eyes. And now she thought she could see something else in them. Not desperation. Relief. The creature's form was starting to fade, growing paler, more transparent. "Thomas?" The word came out as barely a whisper. The wolf's tail moved once, just slightly. Not quite a wag. More like an acknowledgement. Margaret's chest tightened so hard she couldn't breathe. "Thomas, is that you?" The wolf took one step toward her, close enough now that she could have touched it if she'd dared. Its massive head lowered until it was level with hers. The temperature in the barn dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Margaret could see her breath. Ice formed on the metal tools hanging from nails on the wall. The wolf's form grew brighter, more solid, more real than anything else in the barn. She could see every detail now. The scars on its muzzle, the gray around its eyes, the particular way its left ear had a notch taken out of it, just like the notch Thomas had in his ear, from where a bull had caught him when he was young and stupid. Recognition hit her like a fist to the stomach. "What happened to you?" Her voice broke. Tears ran hot down her cold cheeks. The wolf, Thomas, or what was left of him, closed its eyes. When it opened them again, they weren't silver anymore. They were brown, dark brown like creek stones, like Thomas's eyes had been. The creature leaned forward until its nose almost touched her forehead, and she felt something. Not cold, not heat, just a pressure, like a memory of a touch, like a goodbye that came 5 years too late. Then the wolf pulled back and turned toward the darkest corner of the barn. Margaret followed its gaze. In the shadows back there, mostly hidden by a broken hay rake, she saw something else. Something she'd mistaken for a pile of old canvas 1,000 times. But now, seeing it with different eyes, she knew. The shape was wrong for canvas. Too long, too narrow. The wolf moved toward it and she followed on hands and knees, the money forgotten behind her. Her whole body shook. She knew what she was going to find before she got there, had known somewhere deep and buried for 5 years. But knowing and seeing are different things. The bones were still wrapped in Thomas's coat, the one with the silver conchos down the front that he'd been so proud of. His skull lay on its side, facing away from her. Even with the coat rotted and the flesh long gone, she could see the bullet hole in the back of the head, clean and round and final. The wolf sat down next to the remains, and when Margaret looked up at it, she saw that it was crying. Not quite tears. Ghosts don't cry like living things do, but something like tears. Frost forming and falling from its eyes like frozen rain. She reached out with one shaking hand and touched the skull. The bone was cold and smooth. Real. Her husband had been here the whole time, in their barn, under the hay and the dust and the cobwebs, while she'd searched every canyon and gully for miles, while she'd stayed up nights wondering if he'd left her, if he'd run off with the money and started new somewhere else, while she'd slowly sold off everything they'd built together just to keep food on the table. He'd been right here, dead, murdered, hidden, and somehow, impossibly, still trying to protect her. Who did this? She looked at the wolf, but it was fading now, growing transparent again. The brown was leaving its eyes, replaced by that silver glow. Its form flickered like a lamp running out of oil. Thomas, who did this to you? Who killed you? The wolf's mouth opened, and she thought again that it might speak, but it couldn't. Whatever rules governed this impossible thing, speech wasn't part of them. Instead, it looked at the saddlebag, then at the money, then at her. The message was clear enough. Someone had wanted what Thomas was carrying, had wanted it bad enough to kill. Margaret stood slowly, using the hay rake to pull herself up. Her knees cracked, her back ached. She was suddenly, crushingly aware of how old she'd gotten, how much life had taken from her. But she picked up the rifle anyway, checked that it was loaded. The wolf watched her do it, and something like approval showed in its face. Whatever had happened to her husband, whoever had put that bullet in his skull and hidden him in his own barn, they'd gotten away with it for 5 years. They'd let her suffer and struggle and nearly starve. They'd probably slept sound every night, thinking they'd gotten away clean. She looked at the money still sitting in the straw, then at the letters she hadn't examined yet, then at the wolf, which was now barely visible even in the barn's shadows. "I'll find them," she said. Her voice was steadier now, harder. The voice she'd used when wild dogs came for the chickens, when rustlers tested her fences, when traveling salesmen tried to cheat her because they thought a widow alone was easy pickings. "Whoever did this to you, Thomas, I'll find them. I promise you that." The wolf's tail moved once more. Then its form broke apart like smoke in wind and it was gone. Margaret stood alone in the barn with a dead man's bones and blood money, and a head full of questions that were about to become someone else's problem. She gathered the letters carefully, folded them into her dress pocket, left the money where it was for now. Evidence, she figured, though evidence of what she wasn't quite sure yet. Walked back out into the July heat, which hit her like a wall after the barn's cold. The sun was exactly where it had been before. The grasshoppers still buzzed. The creek still trickled. The world had kept turning while hers had shattered and reformed into something different. She looked down at her hands. They'd stopped shaking. That surprised her more than anything else that had happened. Her husband was dead. Truly, finally dead. Not missing, not run off, but murdered and buried in shallow dirt by someone he'd probably trusted. She'd just seen his spirit in the form of a wolf the size of a horse. She'd found enough money to save her ranch and solve the mystery of where he'd gone. And her hands were steady as stone. Maybe, she thought, you could only be surprised so many times in one day before surprise just gave up and went home. The walk back to the house seemed shorter. Margaret climbed the porch steps, the same steps the wolf had climbed, though it hadn't really climbed at all, and went inside. The cabin was dark and cool and smelled like the cornbread she'd made that morning. Everything looked exactly as it had before. The table where she and Thomas had eaten breakfast together for 47 years. The chair he'd carved for her as a wedding present. The window that looked out over the creek. It all seemed impossible, looking at it now. That life had been simple once. That she'd once worried about small things like whether to plant corn or wheat, whether to mend a fence today or tomorrow. She sat down at the table and spread out the letters. There were 11 of them, all addressed to Thomas, all from Denver. The first was dated 2 days before he disappeared. Margaret recognized the handwriting before she saw the signature. Bernard Cutler, Thomas's business partner, the man who'd loaned them money to buy their first cattle, the man who'd stood up at their wedding, the man who'd wept with her when their youngest boy died of scarlet fever. Her hands started shaking again. She opened the first letter and began to read. By the third letter she understood. By the fifth she knew. By the 11th she was standing at the window, gripping the sill so hard her knuckles went white, staring out at the prairie that stretched all the way to Denver. Bernard had been cheating them for years, skimming profits, forging accounts. When Thomas discovered it and threatened to go to the law, Bernard had made him an offer, a sum of money, the money now sitting in her barn, in exchange for silence. Thomas had taken it, had been bringing it home, had almost made it, but Bernard must have changed his mind, must have decided that silence purchased was less permanent than silence buried. Margaret turned from the window. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark glass of the china cabinet, and she barely recognized the woman looking back. 73 years old, face lined as dried leather, hair white as alkali, hands gnarled from work. She looked like someone who should be sitting in a rocking chair, knitting, waiting quietly for death. But her eyes were Thomas's eyes, in that moment, hard and clear, and full of purpose. She picked up the rifle again, checked the ammunition one more time. Outside, the sun was starting its long slide toward evening. Denver was 3 days' ride. 4 if you were old and careful. She was old, but she'd forgotten how to be careful the moment a ghost wolf sat down on her porch and asked for help. Margaret pulled down the carpet bag she used for travel and started packing. Ammunition, dried meat, a canteen, the letters, and Thomas's wedding ring, which she pulled from the chain around her neck where she'd worn it for 5 years. He'd want it back, she thought. Want it with him when this was finished? Whatever else happened, whatever else she had to do, she'd make sure Bernard Cutler understood exactly what he'd taken, and exactly what it cost. Margaret left before dawn, when the prairie was still gray and the stars were fading like dying embers. She'd wrapped Thomas's bones in clean canvas and buried them proper in the family plot behind the house, next to their boys. Said words over him that should have been said 5 years ago. The money stayed hidden in the barn, tucked under a loose floorboard. She took only what she needed. The rifle, the letters, and a fury that had been building for half a decade without knowing where to aim itself. Her horse, an old mare named Bess, seemed to sense the weight of what they were doing. The animal's ears kept swiveling back, listening. The ride to Denver normally took 4 days if you pushed hard and knew the trail. Margaret gave herself 5. She wasn't 20 anymore, and Bess was older than that. They moved steady through the morning, following the creek bed north until it joined up with the stage road. The sun climbed and beat down. Her back ached. Her hands cramped on the reins. But every time she thought about stopping, she saw that bullet hole in Thomas's skull, saw Bernard Cutler's signature at the bottom of those letters, saw 5 years of her life spent wondering and grieving when she should have been hunting. The pain in her back didn't seem important after that. By midday, she reached Marker's Creek. a watering hole where the stage stopped to change horses. There was a trading post there, run by a half-Cheyenne man named Joseph, who'd sold her supplies before. He came out when he heard Bess's hooves, wiping his hands on his apron, took one look at Margaret's face and the rifle across her saddle, and his expression changed. "Mrs. Dalton," he said carefully, "long time since you came this way." She dismounted slow, feeling every one of her 73 years in her knees. "Need to water my horse, Joseph, and I need information." Joseph filled a bucket from the well while Margaret loosened Bess's girth. The mare drank deep and grateful. "What kind of information?" he asked. Margaret pulled out the most recent letter, the one dated the day before Thomas disappeared. "Bernard Cutler. You know him?" Joseph's face went carefully blank. That told her what she needed to know even before he spoke. "Everyone knows Bernard Cutler, ma'am. He's got holdings all over the territory, cattle, land, silver mines up in the mountains." He paused. "Important man, connected man." Margaret folded the letter and tucked it back in her pocket. "He murdered my husband." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Joseph looked around, checking to see if anyone else was nearby. The trading post was empty except for them and a lazy dog sleeping in the shade. "That's a serious accusation," he said quietly. "The kind that gets people hurt." Margaret met his eyes. "I already been hurt, Joseph. I've been hurt for 5 years while that man walked free. I found Thomas's body yesterday, found these letters, found out the truth." She pulled out the whole stack and held them where he could see. "I'm going to Denver. I'm going to make this right. But I need to know what I'm walking into." Joseph was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded, once sharp. "Come inside. I'll tell you what I know." They sat at a rough wooden table while Joseph poured coffee that was more grounds than water. His wife had died the same winter Thomas disappeared, and the trading post had the empty feel of a place where grief lived. "Bernard Cutler owns half of Denver now," Joseph said. "Maybe more. He's got the mayor in his pocket, the sheriff. Most of the merchants owe him money or favors. He's not the kind of man you confront directly, Mrs. Dalton. He's the kind who makes people disappear, like he made Thomas disappear." Margaret's hand tightened around the tin coffee cup. "I ain't scared of him, Joseph." The trader shook his head. "Maybe you should be. He's got men, mean ones, the kind who don't ask questions, just do what they're told." He leaned forward. "Listen to me. You ride into Denver with accusations like that. You won't ride out again. Bernard will have you silenced before you get within 100 yards of the law, if the law even cared, which they won't." Margaret sipped the bitter coffee, let it burn all the way down. "Then I won't go to the law." Joseph's eyebrows rose. "What will you do?" She set the cup down. Outside, a dust devil spun across the empty road. "I'll go to him direct. To his house. I'll show him the letters. I'll tell him I know what he did, and I'll give him a choice." Her voice was steady as stone. "He can confess public, can turn himself in and face justice like a man, or he can face me." The trader studied her face for a long time. "You mean that?" It wasn't a question. "I mean that." Margaret stood. Her legs protested but held. "Thank you for the water and the truth. How much do I owe you?" Joseph waved her off. "Nothing. But Mrs. Dalton." He stood too, walked her to the door. "If you're set on this, you should know. Bernard lives in a big house on Larimer Street. Red brick, 3 stories, iron fence around it. He's got guards, and he's got a son now. Boy about 20, named Thomas, if you can believe the nerve of it." Margaret's stomach twisted. "He named his son after mine?" Joseph nodded. "Showed up about 4 years back. Bernard says the boy's his nephew, that his sister died and left him the child, but nobody ever met a sister. Some folks think he just bought the kid to have an heir. Either way, the boy's mean. Meaner than his father." Margaret walked back to Bess and tightened the girth. Her hands moved automatic, the way they'd moved through 1,000 such tasks. But her mind was racing. A son, an heir. That changed things, though she wasn't sure how yet. "This son," she said, not looking at Joseph. "He live in the house too?" The trader nodded. "Him and Bernard and about 6 hired men at any given time. Like I said, Mrs. Dalton, you can't do this alone." She swung up into the saddle, ignoring the pain in her hip. "Watch me." Then she turned Bess north and rode, leaving Joseph standing in the dust with his mouth open. The rest of that day passed in a blur of heat and miles. Margaret's mind wouldn't settle, kept circling back to what Joseph had said. 6 men, guards, a son who was mean. She'd killed men before. One rustler who'd tried to steal cattle, one drunk who'd gotten rough with her in town the year after Thomas disappeared. Both times had been clear-cut, self-defense. This would be different. This would be walking into a fortress and demanding justice from a man who'd already proven he'd kill to keep his secrets. Her hand drifted to the rifle. Thomas had always said she was the better shot between them. She hoped that was still true. She camped that night under a stand of cottonwoods, 20 miles north of Marker's Creek, built a small fire, more for company than warmth, ate dried beef and hardtack that sat like stones in her stomach. Bess grazed nearby, hobbled but content. The stars came out thick and bright, the way they only did in country where darkness still had teeth. Margaret lay on her bedroll and stared up at them, remembering nights like this when she and Thomas had been young, when they'd driven cattle to market together, before the boys were born, when the whole world had seemed like it belonged to them. Those stars had been the same then, unchanging, eternal, while everything beneath them crumbled and died and got buried in barn floors. Sleep came in fits and starts. Every time she drifted off, she saw the wolf. Sometimes it was sitting on her porch, whimpering. Sometimes it was standing over Thomas's bones in the barn. Once she dreamed it was walking beside her through Denver's streets, visible only to her, its silver eyes burning in the daylight. She woke before dawn with her heart pounding and her hand on the rifle. The fire had died to ash. Bess was standing alert, ears pricked toward the darkness. Margaret sat up slowly, listening. For a moment she heard nothing but wind through grass. Then she heard it. Footsteps, human, coming from the direction of the road. She was on her feet with the rifle leveled before whoever it was cleared the trees. A man's voice called out, rough and cautious. "Easy now, just passing through." A figure emerged from the shadows, hands raised. In the pre-dawn gray, Margaret could make out a traveler's pack, worn boots, a hat pulled low. The man stopped when he saw the rifle. "Didn't mean to startle you, ma'am. Saw your fire last night. Figured I'd stop and ask if you'd seen any trouble on the road ahead." Margaret kept the rifle steady. Something about his voice nagged at her. "What kind of trouble?" The man lowered his hands slowly, took a step closer. "The kind that comes for old women traveling alone with vengeance on their minds." Margaret's blood went cold. The man pushed back his hat, and in the growing light she saw his face clearly for the first time. Young, hard, with Bernard Cutler's eyes and Thomas's name. The son. He smiled, and it wasn't pleasant. "My father sent me to talk sense into you, Mrs. Dalton. Before you do something you'll regret." Her finger tightened on the trigger. "How did you know I was coming?" Thomas Cutler. The name sat wrong in her mouth, like she was being forced to speak blasphemy. Shrugged. "Joseph at Marker's Creek gets paid to send word when certain people pass through. You didn't really think a half-breed trader would keep your secrets, did you?" Margaret's jaw clenched. She'd been foolish, trusting. She'd thought Joseph was a friend, but everyone had a price and Bernard knew how to pay it. "Your father killed my husband," she said. Her voice shook, but the rifle didn't. "I've got proof. I've got his letters. I know what he did." The young man's smile widened. "So what? You think anyone's going to believe a crazy old widow over Bernard Cutler?" He took another step. Margaret raised the rifle to her shoulder. "Stop moving." He stopped, but his hand drifted toward his belt, where she now saw a pistol tucked. "Here's how this is going to go," he said. "You're going to give me those letters. Then you're going to ride back to your little ranch and forget this whole thing. My father's prepared to be generous. He'll send money. Enough to keep you comfortable for whatever time you've got left." He paused. "Or you can refuse. And I've got 6 more men waiting down the road who'll make sure you never reach Denver at all. Your choice." Margaret's mind raced. 6 men. She'd thought she had the element of surprise, but Bernard had known she was coming before she'd even left. Had sent his son, his cruel, bought son wearing her husband's name like a costume, to stop her. The smart thing would be to hand over the letters, ride home, live whatever years she had left in quiet defeat. The smart thing would be to recognize when you were beaten. But Margaret had stopped being smart the moment she saw a ghost wolf on her porch. "I'm not giving you a damn thing," she said, and pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the dawn like thunder. Thomas Cutler jerked backward, his hat flying off. Margaret's ears rang. For one terrible moment she thought she'd killed him, but he rolled to the side, coming up with his pistol drawn, and she realized she'd only grazed his shoulder. Blood darkened his shirt. His face twisted with rage. "You stupid old..." He fired. The bullet whined past Margaret's head so close she felt the wind of it. She dove behind a cottonwood trunk, levering another round into the Winchester's chamber. Bess screamed and bolted, hobbles and all, crashing away through the brush. Margaret's heart hammered so hard she could barely hear over it. Her hands were shaking again, the rifle barrel trembling. Thomas Cutler was moving. She could hear his boots in the grass, circling around to get a better angle. "Those men I mentioned?" he called out. "They heard the shot. They're coming now. You've got maybe 2 minutes before you're surrounded. Last chance to surrender." Margaret leaned out from behind the tree, saw his shadow moving through the gray dawn. Fired. Missed. His return shot splintered bark inches from her face, and she jerked back, breathing in gasps. She was going to die here. 73 years old, shot dead under cottonwoods by a man wearing her husband's name. But then she heard something else, a sound that made the hair on her neck stand up. A howl, low and deep and not quite natural. Thomas Cutler heard it too. His footsteps stopped. "What the hell?" The howl came again, closer now, and with it came that impossible cold. Margaret saw her breath mist in the air, saw frost form on the grass, and then she saw the wolf. It came out of the dawn like something conjured from her dreams, massive and pale and burning with silver light. Its lips were pulled back from teeth the size of knife blades, its eyes fixed on Thomas Cutler with an intensity that was more than animal, more than ghost. It was rage given form. The young man fired. 3 shots, fast. The bullets passed through the wolf like it was made of mist. It didn't even slow down. Thomas Cutler turned and ran. The wolf lunged. Margaret heard him scream, high and terrified and young, and then the screaming stopped. She stayed behind the tree, gripping the rifle, not sure what she was hearing in the sudden silence. Footsteps, heavy footsteps, coming toward her. She risked a look. The wolf sat in the clearing where Thomas Cutler had been standing. There was blood on the grass, a pistol lying abandoned, but no body. The wolf looked at her. Its eyes were brown again. Thomas's eyes. Margaret stepped out from behind the tree. Her legs barely held her. "What did you do?" The wolf turned its massive head toward the north, toward Denver. Then it looked back at her and she understood. A warning. The boy had been the warning. Now the real fight was coming. She heard riders approaching, distant, but getting closer. The 6 men, coming fast. The wolf stood and shook itself, frost and silver light scattering from its fur. Then it moved. Not toward her, not toward the riders, but east into the rough country where the prairie gave way to broken hills and gullies. It looked back once. The message was clear. Follow, or stay and die. Margaret didn't hesitate. She ran. Her old legs protested, her lungs burned, but she ran after the ghost wolf through the gray dawn. Behind her, she heard the riders reach the camp, heard their shouts of confusion and anger, heard them find the blood and the pistol. But by then she was in the gullies, scrambling down a wash behind the wolf, hidden by shadow and broken ground. The wolf moved like smoke, impossible to track, but somehow she kept up. Adrenaline, maybe, or desperation, or the simple fact that Thomas wouldn't let her fall behind. They ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, the wolf stopped in a narrow canyon where water had carved out an overhang in the sandstone. Margaret collapsed against the rock wall, gasping. Her chest hurt. Her vision swam. The wolf sat and watched her, patient and protective. Above, she could hear the riders spreading out, searching. "Find her!" someone shouted. "Bernard wants her alive!" Margaret pulled the rifle close and tried to control her breathing. The wolf's eyes never left hers. In the dim canyon light, she could see through it again, see the rock wall beyond its body. But its presence was solid, real. It wouldn't let anything happen to her. Not yet. Not until this was finished. The searchers passed overhead. Their horses' hooves rained dirt down into the canyon. Margaret held her breath, certain they'd look down, certain she'd be seen. But the wolf's form seemed to blur and expand, creating a haze in the air that made the shadows deeper. The riders kept moving. Their voices faded. When Margaret was sure they were gone, She let out her breath in a shudder. "Thank you," she whispered. The wolf's tail moved once. Then it stood and walked deeper into the canyon, where the shadows were thickest. Margaret followed on unsteady legs. The canyon twisted and turned, and she lost all sense of direction. But eventually it opened up again, and she found herself on a different part of the prairie, miles from where she'd camped. Bess was there. The mare stood grazing as if nothing had happened, her hobbles mysteriously undone. Margaret could have cried with relief. She went to the horse and pressed her face against Bess's warm neck, breathing in the smell of sweat and dust and safety. When she looked up, the wolf was fading, going translucent in the morning light. "Don't go yet," Margaret said. "I don't know what to do now. They know I'm coming, they're hunting me. How am I supposed to—" The wolf's eyes met hers, and somehow, without words, she understood. The front door was closed, so she'd have to go in the back. She spent that day moving slow and careful through the rough country east of the stage road, keeping to the gullies and dry washes where riders couldn't easily follow. The wolf appeared and disappeared like fog, always ahead, always guiding. By evening, she could see Denver in the distance, sprawled across the plain where the South Platte River bent. Smoke from 1,000 chimneys, the railroad line cutting through like a scar, church steeples rising, and somewhere in there, Bernard Cutler's red brick house with its iron fence. Margaret made camp in a stand of willows by a creek and ate the last of her dried beef. Her whole body ached, but her mind was clearer than it had been in years. That night, the wolf came and sat beside her, so close she could have touched it if touching was possible. "I need a plan," she said to it, to Thomas, to the ghost that wouldn't rest. "I can't fight 6 men, can't shoot my way into his house, can't trust the law." The wolf's ears pricked forward. It stood and walked to the edge of the creek, looked down into the water. Margaret joined it. In the reflection, lit by her small fire, she saw something strange. The wolf's reflection showed not a wolf, but a man. Thomas, the way he'd looked before the bullet, before the barn. He was smiling and pointing at something in the water. She looked closer, saw not just water, but darkness, a tunnel mouth. The creek ran through Denver in culverts and pipes. Underground, hidden. Margaret understood. The back door, the way in that Bernard wouldn't be watching. She looked at the wolf, at Thomas, and nodded. "All right, underground it is." The wolf's form blazed bright for just a moment, bright enough to hurt her eyes. Then it faded to nothing, leaving her alone by the creek. But she didn't feel alone. She felt accompanied, felt like she had an army at her back, even if that army was just one ghost and a stubborn refusal to die before justice was served. She lay down and slept better than she had in days. Tomorrow she'd enter Denver. Tomorrow it would end, one way or another. Dawn came cold and pink. Margaret woke stiff but determined. She left Bess tied where the mare could graze and drink, took only the rifle and the letters, and walked into Denver on foot. The city was just waking. Factory workers heading to shifts. Delivery wagons rattling over cobblestones. The smell of coal smoke and horse manure and frying bacon. She kept her head down. Just another old woman in worn clothes. Nobody looked twice. She found the creek where it entered the city through an iron grate, and waited until the street was empty. Then she pried the grate open and climbed down into the darkness. The tunnel was cramped and wet and smelled like things she didn't want to think about. Margaret moved through it bent over, one hand on the slimy wall, the other holding the rifle above the water. It was darker than any night she'd known, but after a few minutes her eyes adjusted, and she could see faint light ahead. Grates in the street above, letting in daylight. She passed under saloons and shops and houses, hearing footsteps and voices and the city's life continuing above her, ignorant of the old woman crawling through the darkness below. Her back screamed. Her knees threatened to give out, but she kept moving, kept following the wolf's guidance, though she couldn't see it down here. After what felt like hours, the tunnel widened. Margaret found herself in a junction where several channels met, and there, carved into the stone, was an arrow. Fresh, not weathered, like someone had scratched it there recently. It pointed down one of the tunnels, the one that ran toward Larimer Street, toward Bernard Cutler's house. Margaret touched the arrow with one wet finger and whispered thanks to whoever, whatever, had left it. Then she followed it into darkness. The tunnel grew narrower. Water rose to her ankles, then her calves. cold enough to steal feeling from her legs. But finally, she saw light ahead. Not from a grate, but from an opening. She emerged into a basement. The room was full of coal and crates and the detritus of wealthy living. Margaret stood dripping and filthy in the middle of Bernard Cutler's cellar. Above her head, she could hear footsteps, voices, someone laughing. She checked the rifle. Still dry, miraculously, fully loaded. She left puddles with every step as she crossed to the stairs and began to climb. Each step was a choice. Each step was a point of no return. At the top, she pressed her ear to the door and listened. Kitchen sounds. Someone washing dishes. The clink of china. She waited until the sounds moved away, then opened the door just a crack. The kitchen was empty. Beyond it, through another door, she could see a hallway. Rich wallpaper, gas lamps, paintings in gold frames. Margaret stepped into Bernard Cutler's house like a ghost herself, wet and silent and carrying death. She moved through the kitchen, through the hallway, following the sound of voices. They were coming from a room at the front of the house, an office by the look of the door. Heavy wood, brass handle. She put her hand on it, felt the metal warm under her palm. This was it. 5 years of grief and struggle and wondering, all about to end. She thought of Thomas, thought of the wolf on her porch, thought of the bullet hole in his skull and the letters in her pocket. Then she opened the door and walked in. Bernard Cutler sat behind a massive desk, papers spread before him. He looked up when the door opened, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion, to recognition. "Margaret?" He stood slowly. He'd aged since she'd last seen him, gray in his beard now, softer around the middle, but his eyes were the same, sharp, calculating. What in God's name? Then he saw the rifle, saw her expression, and understanding dawned. His face went pale. "Margaret, listen, whatever you think." She raised the rifle, pointed it at his chest. Her hands were steady as bedrock. "I know," she said quietly. "I found him, Bernard. I found Thomas." The color drained from his face completely. "I can explain. It was an accident. Things got out of hand. I never meant—" Margaret shook her head. Don't you dare." Her voice cracked. "You shot him in the back of the head. You hit him in his own barn. You let me spend 5 years thinking he'd abandoned me, thinking I'd done something wrong, thinking—" She stopped, breathed. "And then you sent your boy to kill me. Your boy wearing my husband's name." Bernard raised his hands, placating. "Thomas is fine. He's resting. He'll be all right. And I never meant for any of this, Margaret. You have to believe me." "I don't have to believe anything." Margaret pulled the letters from her pocket with her free hand and threw them on the desk. "You cheated us, stole from us for years. And when Thomas found out, you killed him for it. That's not an accident. That's murder." Bernard looked at the letters. Something in his face changed, hardened. "You can't prove any of this. And even if you could, who'd believe you? You're a nobody, a widow. He gestured around at the rich office, the expensive furniture. "I'm Bernard Cutler. I own this city." He took a step toward her. "Put down the gun, Margaret. Let's talk about this reasonable-like." She didn't lower the rifle. "I'm done talking. I came here to give you a choice. Turn yourself in. Confess. Or I'll kill you where you stand." Bernard laughed. Actually laughed. You're going to kill me? An old woman who can barely stand?" He took another step. "I don't think so." Margaret's finger tightened on the trigger. "Try me." For a moment they stood frozen. An old woman and an old man, separated by 5 years of lies and a lifetime of trust destroyed. Then Bernard's hand moved, fast, toward a drawer in his desk. Margaret saw the glint of metal. A gun. She fired. The shot was deafening in the closed room. Bernard jerked backward. The gun fell from his hand. He looked down at the red bloom spreading across his vest, then up at Margaret. His expression was one of pure surprise. "You shot me," he said, like he couldn't quite believe it. "You actually shot me." Then his knees gave out and he fell. Margaret stood frozen, the rifle still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. Bernard Cutler lay on his expensive carpet, blood pooling beneath him. His breathing came in wet, ragged gasps. She'd shot him in the chest, just left of center. Not immediately fatal, but close enough. His hands clutched at the wound, fingers slick and red. Outside the office, she heard shouting. Footsteps running. The shot had brought the whole house. She had maybe 30 seconds before those men burst through the door. 30 seconds to decide if she was going to finish this or run. Bernard's eyes found hers. He tried to speak, blood bubbling at his lips. The door crashed open. 3 men rushed in, guns drawn. They saw Bernard on the floor, saw Margaret standing over him with the Winchester. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the first man raised his pistol. "Drop it, lady. Drop it now or I swear." The temperature in the room plummeted. Margaret's breath misted. Ice formed on the windows, and the wolf appeared. It materialized between her and the men, massive and blazing with silver light. Its lips pulled back in a snarl that showed every tooth. The men stumbled backward, eyes wide with terror. One of them fired. The bullet passed through the wolf and shattered a lamp behind it. "What in hell?" The second man's voice cracked. The wolf advanced, and they ran. Crashed back through the door, shouting about demons and ghosts. Their footsteps thundered down the hallway. Margaret heard them flee the house entirely, heard the front door slam. Then silence. Just her breathing and Bernard's wet gasps and the wolf standing guard. She lowered the rifle slowly. Her whole body was shaking now, the adrenaline draining away and leaving her hollow. She looked at Bernard. He was still conscious, still watching her. Blood had soaked through his vest and pooled on the carpet. He had minutes, maybe less. She walked around the desk and knelt beside him. It was hard getting down, her knees cracking like dry wood. Up close, she could see how pale he'd gone, how his lips had turned blue at the edges. "Why?" Her voice came out hoarse. "Why did you do it, Bernard? We were friends, all of us. You stood up at our wedding." He coughed, spraying red across his chin. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Money. Always money. I was drowning in debt. The mines weren't producing. The cattle market collapsed. I needed—" He coughed again. "I needed yours. And Thomas found out. So you killed him." Margaret's eyes burned, but no tears came. She'd cried all her tears years ago. "You killed him and let me suffer." Bernard's hand moved, reaching toward her. She didn't take it. "It was supposed to be quick, painless. I offered him a deal, half the money to stay quiet. But he wouldn't. Said he'd go to the law. Said—" His breathing hitched. "Said he couldn't look at you and lie, so I had to protect myself." His eyes pleaded with her. "I'm sorry, Margaret. God help me, I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't bring him back." She stood, using the desk to pull herself up. The wolf watched from across the room, its form flickering like a candle flame. "Sorry doesn't give me back 5 years. Doesn't erase wondering if my husband left me because I wasn't enough." Her voice broke. "You took everything, Bernard. And for what? Money." She looked around at the rich office, the paintings, the thick carpet now ruined with blood. Was it worth it? He didn't answer. Couldn't, maybe. His eyes were starting to glaze. His chest rose and fell, each breath shorter than the last. Margaret walked to the window and looked out at Denver. The city went about its business, ignorant of the drama unfolding in this room. Wagons rolled by. People walked. A child chased a hoop down the street. Normal life continuing like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. She'd killed a man. Not in the heat of battle, not in clear self-defense. She'd walked into his house and shot him. The law wouldn't care that he'd murdered Thomas. Wouldn't care about the letters or the buried body. They'd only see an old widow who'd committed murder. She'd hang for this, if they caught her. Behind her, Bernard made a sound. A long, rattling exhale. Then nothing. Margaret turned and saw that his chest had stopped moving. His eyes stared at the ceiling, seeing nothing. Bernard Cutler was dead. The man who'd killed her husband. The man who'd been her friend for 40 years before greed twisted him into something unrecognizable. She felt nothing. No satisfaction. No relief. Just a bone-deep exhaustion that made her want to lie down on that bloody carpet and sleep for 1,000 years. But the wolf moved, drawing her attention. It stood by the door, waiting. Margaret picked up the letters from where they'd fallen on the desk, folded them carefully and put them back in her pocket. Evidence, if anyone ever cared to listen. Then she walked to Bernard's desk and pulled open the drawer he'd been reaching for. Inside was a small revolver, and beneath it, a leather ledger. She opened the ledger and saw columns of numbers, dates. names, amounts. Her name appeared dozens of times, each entry showing money that should have been hers. Money Bernard had skimmed and stolen. The proof was here, all of it. She took the ledger. The wolf led her back through the house, down the hallway, through the kitchen. She moved in a daze, her mind struggling to catch up with what she'd done. In the kitchen, she heard voices outside. The men who'd fled were coming back, bringing others. Bringing the sheriff, probably. The wolf paused at the basement door. Margaret opened it and descended into darkness. Her legs barely held her. Each step felt like it might be her last. Behind her, she heard the front door crash open. Heard boots on hardwood. Heard someone shout, "Find her!" The basement was dark and cold and smelled like coal. Margaret stumbled through it, following the faint silver glow of the wolf's form. She found the tunnel entrance and climbed in, pulling herself through the cramped space. The water was colder than she remembered. Or maybe she was just colder. Her hands were numb. Her feet were numb. Everything felt distant and unreal. She crawled through the darkness, following the wolf's light, hearing shouts echoing through the tunnel behind her. They'd found the basement, found the entrance. They were coming. But the wolf knew shortcuts she didn't. It led her through side tunnels, through junctions she'd missed on the way in. The voices faded. The tunnel grew quieter. Eventually, she saw daylight ahead. Not the grate where she'd entered, but a different exit. A drainage pipe that emptied into the creek on the eastern edge of the city. She emerged into afternoon sunlight, gasping and shaking. Her clothes were soaked. Her hair hung in wet ropes. She looked like something that had crawled out of a grave. The wolf stood on the bank, watching her, waiting. Margaret pulled herself out of the water and lay on the grass, staring up at the sky. Clouds drifted past, white and innocent. Birds sang. The creek burbled. Everything was beautiful and terrible, and she couldn't feel any of it. She'd killed a man. Her husband's killer, yes. But still, she'd taken a life. Had looked Bernard Cutler in the eyes and pulled the trigger. Her hands were still steady. That was the most disturbing part. They should be shaking. Should be trembling with horror at what she'd done. But they were calm. Ready. Like this was just another task completed. Like shooting a man was no different from churning butter or mending a fence. The wolf nudged her with its nose. Not physically. The touch was more like a memory of pressure, but insistent. She sat up. In the distance, she could see riders leaving Denver, heading toward the creek. Searching for her. She couldn't stay here. Couldn't rest. Not yet. She stood on legs that felt like water and stumbled along the creek bed, following it south. Away from the city. Away from Bernard Cutler's body cooling on his office floor. Away from the life she'd known and into something new and uncertain. The wolf walked beside her, keeping pace, protecting her one last time. She found Bess where she'd left her, still grazing peacefully in the willows. The mare nickered when she saw Margaret, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if her rider hadn't just committed murder. Margaret untied the reins with numb fingers and pulled herself into the saddle. Every muscle screamed. Her vision swam, but she turned Bess south and rode. The wolf ran ahead, a silver streak in the fading light. They moved through the rough country, avoiding roads, avoiding people. As the sun set, Margaret looked back once. Denver sprawled in the distance, lights beginning to wink on. Somewhere in that city, the law was looking for her. Warrants being written, descriptions being circulated. An old woman, armed, dangerous. Night fell. Margaret kept riding. The wolf's light guided her through the darkness. She didn't know where she was going. Home wasn't an option. They'd look for her there first. She had no friends left, no one she could trust. Joseph had betrayed her. Bernard was dead. Thomas had been dead for 5 years. She was alone in the world except for a ghost and a horse. They rode through the night, stopping only once to let Bess drink and rest. Margaret sat against a rock and stared at nothing. Her mind kept replaying the moment she'd pulled the trigger. The surprise on Bernard's face. The blood. The fall. Dawn came gray and cold. Margaret woke. She dozed without meaning to and found the wolf sitting next to her. Its form was different somehow. Fainter. More transparent. She could barely see it in the morning light. "Are you leaving?" She didn't know why she asked. Didn't know if it could answer. But the wolf's eyes met hers and she saw the truth there. Yes, its task was done. Justice had been served. However roughly, however bloodily, Thomas's killer was dead. The wolf had guided her through, kept her alive long enough to finish it. Now it could rest. I don't know what to do now. Margaret's voice cracked. Tears finally came, hot and unexpected. I killed him. I murdered a man. What kind of person does that make me? The wolf leaned forward and pressed its nose to her forehead. And in that touch, that memory of a touch, she felt something. Not absolution, not forgiveness, but understanding. Thomas understood. Would have done the same if their positions were reversed. Would have walked through hell itself to protect her, to avenge her. Love didn't die with the body. It persisted. It transformed. It became ghost wolves that sat on porches and led old women through darkness. The wolf pulled back. Its form was barely visible now, just a shimmer in the air, like heat rising from summer stone. Margaret reached out, but there was nothing to touch. Just memory. Just love. Thank you, she whispered, for coming back, for helping me, for everything. The wolf's tail moved once. Then it turned and walked toward the rising sun. With each step, it grew fainter, more transparent, until finally, it was gone. Just gone. Margaret was alone on the prairie with the wind and the grass and the terrible freedom of having done the unforgivable thing. She rode south for 3 more days, avoiding towns, avoiding people, living on what game she could shoot and water from creeks. Her mind slowly cleared. The numbness faded, replaced by a clarity that was almost painful. She'd killed Bernard Cutler. That was true. It was also true that he'd killed Thomas, that he'd let her suffer for 5 years, that he'd tried to kill her too, through his son and his hired men. Self-defense, maybe. Justice, certainly. The law wouldn't see it that way. But Margaret found she didn't care what the law thought anymore. On the 4th day, she reached the border of New Mexico territory. The landscape changed, became drier and harsher. Mountains rose in the distance, purple and ancient. She stopped at a small settlement, barely more than a trading post and a scattering of houses. An old Mexican woman sold her supplies and asked no questions. Didn't even blink at Margaret's appearance, at the rifle, at the haunted look in her eyes. Just took her money and handed over dried beans and cornmeal and jerky. "Safe travels, Senora," she said. "May God watch over you wherever you're going." Margaret thanked her and rode on. She didn't know where she was going. Maybe California, maybe Mexico proper. Somewhere far from Denver and warrants and the memory of blood on expensive carpet. She had the money from the barn, enough to start over if she was careful. Had the letters and the ledger as proof of her story, if anyone ever cared to hear it. Had her life, hard-won and blood-bought. That was more than Thomas had gotten. More than she'd thought she'd have when she'd walked into Bernard Cutler's office. A week later, she reached a small valley tucked between red rock hills. There was water there, a spring-fed creek, and grass for Bess. No towns nearby, no people. Just space and silence and a sky so big it hurt to look at. Margaret made camp, built a fire, ate beans cooked in an old tin can, and as the stars came out, she thought about Thomas. Not the ghost, not the wolf, but the man. The young man who'd courted her in Missouri, who'd brought her west when they were barely more than children, who'd built a ranch with his own hands, who'd given her sons, who'd loved her for 47 years. "It's done," she said to the empty night. "Bernard's dead, your boys are grown and gone. The ranch," she stopped, swallowed hard. "I don't know about the ranch. Maybe the bank took it by now. Maybe it's still standing. But I can't go back, Thomas. You understand that, don't you?" The wind moved through the grass, soft and constant. It almost sounded like an answer. Margaret wrapped her blanket tighter. "I hope you're at peace now. I hope wherever you are, however it works, you're not suffering anymore. Not trapped. Not watching over some foolish old woman who couldn't let go." She lay down and looked up at the stars. The same stars she'd seen with Thomas a lifetime ago. The same stars that had watched their whole story unfold. The joy and the tragedy and everything in between. She thought about Bernard's last words, his apology. She still didn't forgive him, didn't think she ever would. But she understood in a way. Understood how fear could make people do terrible things. How desperation could twist friendship into murder. Understanding didn't mean forgiveness, but it meant she could finally stop carrying the weight of hate. Could set it down here in this valley and walk away lighter. Sleep came easier than it had in days. No dreams of wolves or blood or barn floors. Just darkness and rest, and the sound of water over stone. When she woke, the sun was already high. She'd slept longer than she'd meant to. Bess grazed nearby, content. Margaret stood and stretched, feeling the familiar ache of old joints and hard living. But underneath the ache was something else, something she barely recognized. Not happiness, it was too soon for that, but maybe the beginning of peace. The first small seed of it anyway. She decided to stay in the valley for a while. Maybe a week, maybe longer. There was no rush, no one to answer to. No law on her trail, not yet anyway. Maybe never, if she was lucky. Small-town sheriff in Denver probably had better things to do than chase old women across state lines. Or maybe they'd hunt her until they found her. Either way, she'd have this moment, this valley. This brief span of freedom between the crime and whatever came after. She'd take it, hold it, remember it when the darkness came again. Days passed in quiet routine. She hunted rabbits and sage grouse, collected firewood, mended her clothes, washed in the creek, gasping at the cold, read through Thomas's letters one more time, memorizing every word, then burned them, watching the paper curl and blacken and turn to ash. The evidence gone, the proof destroyed. All that remained was her word, her truth, and if no one believed her, well, she'd lived with worse. At night, she'd sit by the fire and talk to Thomas, not praying exactly, just talking, telling him about her day, about the hawk she'd seen hunting, about the way the light turned the red rocks gold at sunset. On the 8th day, a rider appeared. Margaret saw him coming from a mile away, just a speck moving across the plain. Her hand went to the rifle, but as he got closer, she saw he was old, thin, riding a mule instead of a horse. He stopped at the edge of her camp and raised his hands. "Don't mean no harm, ma'am, just passing through. Saw your fire last night." Margaret kept the rifle ready but didn't point it at him. "Where you headed?" The old man shrugged. "Nowhere in particular, everywhere in general. I'm what you might call a wanderer." He dismounted slowly, moving like every joint hurt. Up close he looked ancient, weathered face mapped with wrinkles, eyes that had seen too much. "Name's Ezekiel," he said. "Mind if I water my mule?" Margaret nodded toward the creek. While he tended his animal, she studied him. Something about him seemed familiar, though she was certain they'd never met. He caught her looking and smiled. "You're wondering if I'm law. I ain't. Haven't worn a badge in 30 years. These days I just drift. Help folks when I can. Move on when I can't." They sat by the fire that evening, sharing Margaret's coffee and Ezekiel's hardtack. He didn't ask about her past. Didn't pry. Just talked about the country and the weather and a coyote he'd seen that morning. It was the most normal conversation Margaret had had in weeks. When the fire died down, Ezekiel stood to leave. "Thank you for the hospitality, ma'am. I'll be moving on at first light." Margaret nodded. Then, surprising herself, she spoke. "There's a ranch, 5 days north of here, near the creek that feeds into the South Platte. It's called the Double T. Was mine once. Might still be standing." Ezekiel looked at her with those old, knowing eyes. "You want me to check on it?" She shook her head. "No. Just, if you pass that way and it's still standing, maybe put fresh flowers on the grave behind the house. There's 3 markers there, my husband and my boys." He was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "I can do that." He mounted his mule. "You take care of yourself, ma'am. Whatever you're running from, I hope it don't catch you." He rode off into the darkness and Margaret was alone again, but somehow less lonely than before. She stayed in the valley another week, then packed her few belongings and rode west, following the sun toward California and the ocean she'd never seen. Bess was getting old. Margaret was older, but they had miles left in them, had life left in them. Whatever came next, capture, freedom, death, she'd face it the way she'd faced everything else, with her eyes open, with her spine straight, with the knowledge that she'd done what needed doing. Bernard Cutler had murdered her husband. She'd made him pay for it. The law might call that wrong. God might judge her for it. But Thomas's ghost had guided her through, and that was the only judgment she cared about. Years later, though Margaret couldn't say how many, time had gotten slippery in her old age. She sat on a beach in California and watched the sunset paint the ocean gold. She'd found work in a small town, cleaning rooms at a boarding house, had made a few friends who didn't ask about her past, had built a small life out of silence and simplicity. The law had never found her, or maybe they'd stopped looking. Either way, she was free as someone with blood on their hands could ever be. She thought about Thomas every day, about the wolf, about that moment in Bernard's office when everything changed. Sometimes on foggy mornings when the mist rolled in from the ocean, she'd see a shape moving through the gray, large, four-legged, gone before she could focus on it. She'd stopped being surprised by impossible things, had stopped questioning whether the world was stranger than she'd been taught. Thomas had come back as a ghost wolf to lead her to justice. That was real. Everything else that followed was just living with the consequences, and Margaret had gotten good at that. Had spent 70-plus years learning to live with loss and grief and the weight of hard choices. The sun sank lower. The ocean darkened from gold to red to purple. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter and thought about the valley in New Mexico, the peaceful days there. The last time she'd truly felt Thomas's presence. Maybe that's where she'd end up when her time came, back in that valley, between red rocks and big sky. She'd like that. Would like to rest somewhere quiet, where no one knew her name or her crimes, where she was just another old woman who'd lived and loved and done what she thought was right. The world would judge her for it, but she'd stopped caring about the world's judgment long ago. She stood slowly, feeling every one of her years in her knees and back, and walked back to the boarding house. There was dinner to prepare, floors to sweep, tomorrow's work to think about. Life continued as it always did. The dead stayed dead. The living kept living. And somewhere between those two truths, Margaret Dalton had found something like peace. It wasn't the life she'd planned, wasn't the ending she'd imagined when she was young and full of dreams, but it was hers, hard-won and blood-bought and honest, and that, she thought, was enough. Sometimes the hardest things we do are the most necessary. Justice doesn't always come wrapped in a neat package with a bow on top. Sometimes it comes in the dark of night, carried by an old woman with a rifle and a ghost wolf at her side. What would you have done in Margaret's place? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this story touched you, if it made you think or feel, please subscribe. I've got many more stories to share, and I'd be honored to have you along for the journey.